here. Welcome to our Convergence Accelerator workshop. We're so pleased with all of the enthusiasm for this topic as we look at using technology to mitigate institutional racism in educational systems. The purpose of this is to bring together thought leaders to discuss and to reach a consensus on what is the best way for us to understand how to leverage the technological opportunities that we have, and also the current thinking and scholarship around social and behavioral sciences to envision and reimagine the educational system of the future that is free of the burden of institutional racism. My name is Ivory Tolson. I'm the president of the QEM Network. I'm also a professor of psychology at Howard University and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education, and the principal investigator of this National Science Foundation funded workshop grant proposal. Our program director is Linda Monar. She is in the Office of Integrative Activities at the National Science Foundation. She's going to start us off by telling us more about the Convergence Accelerator and give us some perspective of what our charge for today is. So I'll turn it over to Linda at this point.
Thank you, Ivory. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have so many people join us today. As Ivory said, we did get a lot of enthusiasm about this workshop. First and foremost, before I begin, I want to thank Ivory because when this workshop proposal came into NSF and the Convergence Accelerator, we were all very excited about it. But we were working on a little bit of a different time scale than Ivory had intended. He has a very broad and lovely vision of this topic across education and healthcare and the criminal justice system. And I said, Ivory, but we need you to do this sooner. And so the first workshop was supposed to be in November, but he really just, was great in pulling together so many people of this breadth and depth in such a short time frame. And I really appreciate that, to be able to have this workshop today on October 1st and to have our first session focus on education, because that is a topical area that was closest to NSF and what we're doing, and I thought it would be a logical place to start. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the Convergence Accelerator to set the context for the goal of the workshop, which is the hope of becoming a topic for a new Convergence Accelerator solicitation. In the Convergence Accelerator, we sit in the Office of the Director. We are a relatively new entity that focuses on accelerating solutions that have huge societal impact. This program is quite differentiated from the rest of NSF. NSF has a very broad mission.
Linda, we're seeing your view. We're seeing the editor's view. Can you switch display? Come on.
Sorry.
We're seeing your.
Thank you for letting me know that.
Come on. Just.
My apologies. Thank you, Nakia. Much appreciated.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, Nakia. It's all teamwork. So the broad, mission of NSF is to promote the progress of science across all science and technology disciplines, including the social sciences. And what's really cool about being in NSF is that we have a lot of flexibility. We're not DOE or DOD that have a stated top-down mission. As program directors, we have a lot of opportunity to put forth ideas from the community. And that's something that NSF does incredibly well, in that they seek input from the community to promote some of our directives. A couple years ago, we reached out to the community, and that resulted in a program of NSF's 10 Big Ideas, one of which is growing convergence research. So convergence research is born out of the concept that, we have these grand challenges today, and they are not going to be solved by one discipline working alone. They require convergence across fields. And while the rest of NSF funds mostly fundamental research, this program is focused on the accelerated transition of convergence research into practice areas to address these grand challenges. So the vision for this program, which was piloted in 2019, is to use an innovation model, convergence research and multidisciplinary teams to disrupt this usual way of doing business and to create a new ecosystem of researchers who focus on transition to practice. So it's a new innovation model that requires diversity across not just disciplines, but also partnerships across sectors to include academia, industry, nonprofits, government, and other sectors. This is important because through the Convergence Accelerator, we can fund industry and nonprofits directly. We don't only fund institutes of higher education. So why is NSF doing this now? We are in a moment of unprecedented challenges facing the human race, and it is our attempt to bring together the brightest minds in the nation, both across disciplines, across sectors, and with global partnerships to solve these challenges. So this is the program structure, and today what we're working on is this first part that you're part of, the Convergence Accelerator tracks, where we gather input from the community to identify topics that can address large societal needs. If chosen as a topic for the accelerator, it will become part of a solicitation, including the opportunities for Phase 1 and Phase 2 awards. The Phase 1 awards are planning awards over a 9-month period and approximately $1 million, where there will be time to further develop the initial concept, to build your team and team members, participate in the innovation curriculum. The Phase 2 awards are then a down select from approximately 20 teams awarded in Phase 1 to 5 teams that would be awarded $5 million in the form of a cooperative agreement. So it's really about implementation for the work. So the points of emphasis for today's workshop, and these are the solicitation review criteria that we use. First, convergence, partnerships, again, not just across disciplines, but across sectors, and including different fields like the social science aspects and partners that maybe you're not used to working with. And then we're also focused on deliverables. We need to have something, some sort of prototype, living test bed, or a tool that can be delivered to the American people in a 3-year time frame, the time frame of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 awards. So, and then again, the workshop report for this workshop, which already has a great start with the white paper that Ivory provided to everyone, that workshop report would be used as a reference for the community. So we ask for everyone's input and engagement on that today. Just to give you an idea of what some of the tracks topics have looked like in the past, the 2019 launched pilot had Track A and Track B teams that were born out of NSF Big Ideas, harnessing the data revolution and the future of work at the human technology frontier. Then in 2020, we had the quantum technology track, so we just awarded Phase 1 teams. What I want you to take note from this slide are 2 things. First, it's a very broad topic, quantum technology. It has 5 subtopics. And the last subtopic is quantum workforce. This is super important because I think we have an opportunity to influence the education of the future workforce, to equitably provide opportunities for folks in these new and exciting technology areas. So education is very important across the Convergence Accelerator. Track D, again, a very broad topic with subtopics. So this slide, compliments of Dr. Nakia Goldborn, helps us to illustrate convergence. And so we are not making a mixed salad today. We're not just taking separate disciplines and folks from different sectors and mixing them together. We're making smoothies. So it's really true integration of disciplines and sectors represented in a project. Partnerships are also very key, and partnerships can come in different things. They can be partnerships that provide funding or resources, but they can also, because we focus on use-inspired research, they can also be groups of users that you would partner with to get their feedback on your pilot or prototype that you're producing. They can also be folks who get involved in that prototyping research and then provide you with data or other resources to move your work forward. We also focus on deliverables. So for the Convergence Accelerator, research papers are not sufficient. We don't necessarily want deliverables that result in commercialization because NSF does not fund commercialization in the Convergence Accelerator. But what we want you to identify are unmet needs and develop the needed tools, test beds, and living labs to help move the field forward. So at the same time, while you're thinking, what accelerated convergence research can we produce in the next 3 years? What is that long-term 10-year goal? How can we really change how education looks 10 years from now? And then each topic, keep in mind, we'll fund a cohort of diverse teams. So as I mentioned on a previous slide, for the phase 1 track so far, we fund approximately 20 teams. And so that team works in cooperation and competition across that whole cohort of teams. So there's just a couple things I want you to keep in mind today as we go through the workshop. And the first one is to really think big. You know, we have an opportunity here to get substantial resource, especially if we can bring in other partners to do something very big, to be very disruptive and transformative in your thinking, and also to build an ecosystem. So this is just an analogy. Actually, I'm working on 3 other workshops, all of which are roughly in the areas of sustainability. And ClearFlame is a company that I funded through NSF SBIR. ClearFlame works on developing new cleaner fuels for heavy-duty engines. And they get a large-scale heavy-duty transportation that happens across our country and others. That's a huge problem. Tesla also solving a hard problem, but even if the 1% buy Teslas, we're not going to move the needle as much as we would if we focus on something like heavy-duty engines, which have probably 25 times the more impact by solving that hard problem instead. So again, I would encourage you to really think big, not just about addressing diversity, you know, racial diversity, but gender diversity, neurodiversity. I have a future of work team that's working on neurodiverse individuals. And so there's a lot that can be done here. I also want you to think about being disruptive, you know, so it's hard to even remember the days when, you know, you had to go out into the street and hail a taxi cab. You know, with these taxi cabs, that's our educational system today. And we are in a moment where we have an enormous opportunity to disrupt both higher education and K-12 education with everything that's happening in the world. You know, it was geolocation technologies that drove this ability to disrupt the car, to have companies like Uber and Lyft. And I'm not holding those up as the, you know, the best examples of companies and outcome, but just to show you the opportunity we have with new technologies to be disruptive and to make sure that we're equitable in the process. And then lastly, I wanted to remind you that what we're really doing with each Convergence Accelerator track topic is we're building an ecosystem. We have the opportunity to bring in all the different needed partners. And again, I'm showing an example here, sort of a counterexample of an NSF-funded SBIR company and called Branch Technologies. And they did an amazing job of converging artificial intelligence, robotics, and 3D printing to disrupt the construction industry. But being a commercial entity, they didn't have the luxury from the beginning of development to also bring in materials innovation. What if they had brought in materials innovation in the beginning? They could also be developing sustainable construction materials and infrastructure products. What if they had been more equitable? What if they had included more of the community in the thought process and design of what they were working on? So, so I just want to think about, like, you know, who do we have in the room today? Who's missing from the discussion? Who do we need to bring in and make sure that we are inclusive in everyone that has a key interest in this area? And I also wanted to mention that Dr. Melissa Billick, who is the PI of another workshop on the circular economy from molecules to the built environment, showed a great interest in this area, and she and her colleague, Gemma Jang, are also in attendance today and very interested in how we can think across these areas of infrastructure development and equitable education. And then I also wanted to mention that we have 10 NSF staff here today. I apologize, I couldn't find everyone's photo, but they're also listed on page 16 of the white paper that Ivory provided. When Ivory and I had a chat about who should be at the meeting, it took us only 10 seconds to come up with like this amazing list of accomplished people throughout NSF who are very passionate about this topic. Couple things, if you are from NSF, please change your screen name to identify yourself as NSF. And also for everyone who's participating, the folks from NSF have an observer role at the workshop. We're here to observe. We're here to provide guidance on the Convergence Accelerator and other NSF programs. We are not here to influence the trajectory of the discussion. And I should also mention to view us as a resource with regards to NSF. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us directly. I also want to mention that we have two folks in the audience, former NSF folks, Dr. Talisa Washington, who is from the Convergence Accelerator and now is in a new role. So she's no longer NSF, and also Dr. Paige Smith, who's former NSF, also in the audience, as well as my colleague. I will mention Dr. Nakia Goulbourne, who's my colleague from the Convergence Accelerator. So thanks again, Ivory, and thank you everyone for giving us the most precious thing you have, which is your time to discuss this topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Linda, for this presentation and also for your leadership and guidance and thought partnership throughout this entire endeavor. When I first heard from you, to know that you all were interested in this, first thing you asked is if we could accelerate this Convergence Accelerator project, and you committed to working with us to make sure that we had the support at NSF that we needed in order to get this together in a short time frame. So thank you so much. And I also want to reiterate your gratitude towards the 100 plus now who are here and who are interested in this topic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we are here, just for about 10 minutes or less, and then we're going to get into our panel. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see my screen? Okay, I see some nods. All right, so.
Yes.
Thank you. So today we're here to talk about the post-reform era of education, which we envision as an era beyond beyond education as we know it, which revolves a lot around standardization of practice, a hierarchical approach, education leadership that trickles down to the rank and file, a lot of testing, and a lot of things that we know of that's associated with closing the achievement gap, and some of the things that may have had a noble purpose, but they probably have reached their sunset when we think about some of the changes that's happening in society right now. What you're looking at now is the word cloud that was put together based on your responses of why you were interested in participating in this. And you see prominent in this is students, STEM, education, technology, racism, learning, and equity. So all of these are very important keywords, and all of these words capture some aspect of what we're going to be tackling today. Now, all of you all know that institutional racism is a difficult nut to crack.
I think I should just brought my fucking computer upset.
And we've tried a lot of different things, we've studied a lot of different things, and we have learned a lot of things about institutional racism. At this point, we know that some of the things that we may have invested a lot in the past, like achieving diversity is not quite sufficient to ending institutional racism. It certainly brings us closer to where we need to be, but it doesn't adequately end institutional racism. So what we're doing today is trying to think through, how do we end institutional racism by using tools that we may not have the best comprehension of today. Now, I like to use the analogy of the video phone. I know when I was growing up, and I was born in the 70s, I was a child in the 80s, and in a lot of the movies, when they depicted what a video phone would look like, it looked a lot like the image on your left-hand side. It was analog. It combined the telephone, which is something that we knew, and it combined something that looked like a TV. It was connected through a lot of wires and thick wires, because with that kind of data, you needed something very strong to transmit it. Now, what we didn't have at the time is a conceptualization of things like global position systems, internet, wireless connectivity, digital media, social media. So it was hard for us to imagine back in the 80s and even the 90s that the true video phone would look more like what you see on your right-hand side. Now, when we think about a system of education that is free of institutional racism, it's hard for a lot of us to imagine it, because we're subject to the same naive realism that contributed us to imagining the video phone in a certain way. So we tend to use the tools that we understand right now, that we can comprehend, and try to figure out how ending institutional racism looks within the current tools that we already have. This hierarchical structure of education, a system where teachers have certain standards of practice, and they all are charged to do essentially the same thing, where there is this rigid system of education, where data isn't really being tracked at the grassroots level of education. So we don't really track what's going on inside the classroom. We track outcomes. And we have a system that prioritizes practice skills and certain cognitive abilities above some of these broader humanistic characteristics. So when we think about how education looks right now and trying to make certain tweaks to it, it's hard to imagine how you end institutional racism in that. So that goes back to what Linda talked about in the introduction, that we have to think big, we have to be disruptive, and we have to think about the entire ecosystem. Now, when we think about where we are right now as a nation, there are certain realities that is really affecting how we should view education and the future of education. The white minority is imminent. Right now, millennials is the most racially diverse adult population, and we are on track to, by 2035, which is an era that's really around the corner if you think about it. This will be a majority minority nation. We also have to think about globalism. Some people have made comments about the illustration of the white paper, and what you're looking at right now is a part of those illustrations. The illustrator is Kenyan based. And this is someone who I found on Upwork, which is a US platform, but they contract with, or you can contract with, freelancers from all across the nation. So talent doesn't necessarily just have to come from the United States anymore. Embracing globalism is really going to be a part of our survival, and something that the education system has to think about. And third is the automation of the workforce. There's estimates that by 2025, which is only 5 years from now, 47% of the labor force will be automated. So these are some things that's influencing education as we know it right now. So the theory of change that we proposed for the workshop revolves around something called humanistic distributed agency, which combines a concept in organizational and industrial psychology, social and behavioral sciences, as well as technology. And so it's the idea that technology enables us a process through which we can democratize knowledge, we can use data more efficiently, we can democratize data, and we can produce a workforce that is joining forces with technology to make it where the hierarchical approach, where a boss has more knowledge than a so-called subordinate, and we have to standardize things and control every process, we can render a lot of those things obsolete, and we can go from this thought of the importance of standardizing practice to standardizing principle. So in other words, maybe we don't all have to do the same thing. Maybe we just all need to believe the same thing. So it's more important that we all believe that every student should have a shot at success and that they should be accommodated. Maybe it's more important for us to all believe that than for us to all do this certain thing. And technology, in theory, can enable us to do that. It can enable us to give more, to emphasize more humanistic or reprioritize more humanistic qualities over the cognitive abilities. It can enable us to track data and to develop data systems so that deviations from a standard can help the overall system improve. It can create a peer-to-peer network that's kind of like distributed ledgers, where you don't just have one person or this centralized operation of making decisions on behalf of the students, but it could be more of a collaborative model between peers rather than this hierarchical approach. So that's what our theory of change is based on. And so we hope through this, we can find a solution to institutional racism that happens in education, which we believe permeates through the top. It goes through as a conduit the people who have the most power, but are the most distant from what's going on in the day-to-day lives of the students. And we can create a more bottom-up approach where the data is driving practice, where leaders is not based on who knows more, but who knows how to understand, manage, and facilitate data better, and where knowledge can be passed on throughout the entire chain of command, not just held within a certain elite group. So this is what we're aiming to achieve with our conversations here. So to lead these discussions, we have assembled across industry and across disciplines for us to think about the feasibility of this and to also refine this. The theory of change that I presented to you is based on our proposal, but we believe that if we invite more people into this conversation, we can refine that theory and perhaps branch it off into something that looks different. So today, we were careful in identifying people who could speak to various aspects of the issues that's going on and how we can improve things in the future. We knew that we wanted someone who was working within the tech industry. We also knew that we wanted someone who was actually working in the K through 12 environment, so outside of academia. And we also wanted people who were within academia, someone who has actually studied race and equity issues in the school, and also someone who has studied the use of technology in education. So we thought by bringing together these entities, we can find the convergence that's consistent with NSF's model. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. I'm going to tell you all a little bit about all of the panelists first, and then we are going to have every panelist give about a 10-minute presentation on who they are and their work, and then we're going to have a facilitated dialogue. First, I want to introduce Dr. Gloria Lansing Billings, who is a mentor to me and someone who has just really done outstanding work throughout a very distinguished career on looking at race and equity issues in the school. She's pioneered a lot of the research and the thinking that we know on it right now. She's a distinguished professor of urban education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a former president of the American Education Research Association. And her work has focused on critical race theory, applications in education. She's also an acclaimed and award-winning author. And I encourage all of you all to search Amazon and look for her books and make sure that your library is complete with all of her contributions to this field. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Charles Fadell, who was generous enough to provide all of you all with an e-copy of his book. He's had a 25-year career where he's witnessed firsthand the disruptive effects of exponential change. So he brings a unique perspective to education. He's a global contributor to education projects, a thought leader, author, and inventor. His work spans the continuum of schools, higher education, workforce development, and lifelong learning. And he served on many boards and councils that's looked at how to infuse education in the school. And he can he'll bring a unique perspective on looking at not just artificial intelligence, but other emerging technologies and their impact on education. Next, we have David Watkins. David Watkins is someone who I've worked closely with for more than half a decade. I've worked with him at Broward County Schools, which is the seventh largest school district in the nation. He's a director for equity and diversity for this very large and diverse school district. He's an advocate for students of color, and he specializes in breaking that school to prison pipeline. He's implemented some very innovative programs in Broward County, including a state-funded equity initiative where Broward County assigned an equity liaison to every single school in the district. He's also a HBCU, Florida A&M graduate, where he has a master's in social studies, teacher education, and an educational specialist degree. And finally, we have Chinyere Agwana, who has a PhD from Stanford University in electrical engineering. She also is a graduate of Louisiana State University, where I did my undergraduate degree. She is a machine learning researcher with IBM and works on machine learning applications. She has over 6 years of experience working with computer simulations and mathematical modeling. And some of you all may have heard IBM just recently entered into a partnership with historically Black colleges and universities to provide quantum computing to help to build the infrastructure of HBCUs, as well as provide unique learning opportunities for the students. So we're going to go in the order that I just called your name. So we're going to start with Dr. Gloria Lansing Billings.
Well, thank you, Ivory, Dr. Tolson, and thank you to all for having me here. I'm going to start with just a few slides to do what I call some level setting, to sort of talk about the moment that we find ourselves in, because I think we have to expand out from that moment to begin to get our minds wrapped around the task at hand. So if you bear with me, I will share my screen. And let's see. So I've been talking about this notion of a hard reset and as a way to revision education for equity. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of where we are and what our possibilities are. We all talk about pandemics, and we're thinking primarily about the novel coronavirus. It's the reason that we are not all in the same room, while we are unable to travel, while our schools are in virtual learning modes. And that is a real and present danger, given over 201,000 people in this country have died and over 7 million people have contracted this disease. But it's not the only pandemic. We have a pandemic of anti-Black racism that has just, in many ways, just shaken the nation. It culminated, I think, in the death of George Floyd, because we actually got to see 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a man losing his life. It has been riled, of course, this week by the grand jury non-indictment of police officers concerning Breonna Taylor. And those are the two that I think people think about most of the time. But I want to suggest to you that there is a coming economic pandemic because of where we are. I think we all know that the coronavirus has caused people to lose jobs, and we're thinking about people possibly losing housing and some other things. But I think this past week, Citibank released a report that said that the United States had lost $16 trillion because of racism, because of discrimination, because of its unfair housing and hiring practices. So that's another pandemic. And then the fourth one is one that we kind of know about intellectually, but we don't want to talk about that much unless you live in California or in the Gulf Coast states, where we have climate catastrophe. Either it is the raging fires on the West Coast, or these incredible frequency of storms in the Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida region. If you pay attention to these kind of things, you know that this year we have gone through the alphabet with storms. So it's the frequency and the intensity of these storms. We are now in the Greek alphabet of storms. So we're talking about storms beta. Now, as bad as all that is, I'm not sure it's all bad news. And I want to share with you a portion of a statement I've been using a lot from an Indian essayist by the name of Arundhati Roy, when she talks about the nature of pandemics. And if you haven't read this piece, you can easily find it online. Title of the piece is "The Pandemic is a Portal." I just want to read this section to you where she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So I want to suggest that's where we are. We have to be ready to imagine another world, and we have to be ready to fight for it. Right now, most of you are probably hearing all kinds of clamoring from folks talking about we need to get back to school. We want to, when things get back to normal. And I want to suggest to you that normal is the last place that the kids that I care most about want to be. Because in normal, they are in the lowest reading groups. In normal, they don't get access to higher mathematics. In normal, they don't have a fully certified physics teacher. In normal, they don't have a fully equipped chemistry lab. In normal, they are suspended at rates so much higher than their white counterparts. They are expelled. So I'm not interested in getting back to normal at all. The two photos that I have here represent one of an African nation in post-Ebola pandemic, and one in, or epidemic, since it was not pandemic, it was epidemic. And the one on the right is South Korea, and the accommodations they felt necessary to make to bring their schools back online. But I want to get to this notion of resetting. Ivory showed you a picture of the difference between what we thought was going to be a phone that you could actually see folks, a video phone, versus what video phones actually look like. And I want to suggest to you that we all have these devices at our ready. You either have it in your purse, your pocket, or sitting on your desktop, sitting next to your desktop right now. And at some point, it doesn't do what you want it to do. You turn it off, you start it again, you let it rest, you take the SIM card out, you take the battery out, you do all the things that you think you're supposed to do. You even go online to the support group and you do what they suggest. It just doesn't work. And so you find yourself going to the store, either it's the Apple store or an Android store, whether it is the LG or Google Pixel or whatever device you have, but you have to go somewhere to get that phone fixed. And somebody who's probably about 17 years old in a t-shirt will tell you some words you don't want to hear. They will tell you that, you know, I think the only thing we can do is do a hard reset. And those words mean that if you have not backed up pictures, if you have not backed up contacts, if you haven't backed up the last time you played that Candy Crush game, everything is going away. And you will get back in your hands a device that looks like it looked when it came from the factory. And I'm using this analogy to talk about what I think is going to have to happen as a result of these pandemics in our schools if we're going to do this right. And it's not just me sort of making this up. I think it is, there are lessons from history. You have two pictures on the screen. One on the left is post-World War II Japan. You know, once those bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they didn't just sort of clean up and say, okay, well, let's get back to school. Let's get back to normal. You know, open your books. Let's turn to page 27. No, they realized that something had gone drastically wrong in that nation. And so they had to be at a place where they had to rethink their entire school system. Part of their rethinking was the expansion of education for girls. The other part of their rethinking was the reorganization of their schools. They moved away from a strict elementary, secondary to including the middle because of what they were learning about human development and early adolescence. On the right, you see a picture also post-World War II, and that is from Reggio Emilia in Italy. Remember that the Italians were also a part of the Axis. They were also part of who were defeated. But they also decided as a nation, they did not want to create another generation of fascists. And to do it, to make sure that didn't happen, the place they wanted to start was with their very youngest students and early education. And today, we send students all the time and teachers as a part of professional development to Reggio Emilia to see these schools. Now, the sad part about it is, as good as these schools are, they're only replicated in the US in the highest income communities. So there are, you know, white families on the Upper East Side of New York who get to send their kids to Reggio Emilia schools. But those are, I think, just two examples. I want to just close by suggesting to you to remember Katrina. They are our microcosm in Louisiana of a hard reset. Things were bad in Louisiana and in New Orleans in particular before Katrina. Katrina, just like the novel coronavirus, just exposed the inequity. The problem is the establishment in education in New Orleans just wanted to get back to normal. And while they were sort of fiddling around, figuring out how do we get right back to those bad schools we always had, in comes in a more neoliberal group of reformers who said, no, we're going to do something radically different. as a result of that, we now have an entirely charterized school district. There is no public school system as we know it. And despite test gains, and I know that's what's talked a lot about in New Orleans, despite test gains, we have some students who are still totally disenfranchised, who cannot even find a school. We have schools that are picking and choosing their students in the ways that politicians are picking and choosing their voters, in a kind of gerrymandered form of schooling, which doesn't look anything like what democracy ought to offer. So I'm going to suggest that when Linda Molnar said we should think big for me is doing this hard reset, moving away from and not worrying about getting back. But as Kwame Nkrumah said, backward never, forward ever, that we are really going to need to move forward in a very different way with very different ideas. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lansing Billings, for that very thought-provoking presentation. We definitely need to think about that hard reset. Next, we're going to have Dr. Charles Fadell. Before he goes, I just want to make one announcement. Everyone check your name on your profile. Some of you all have entered with a QEM staff member's name for some reason. It's probably a technical glitch on our end, but just make sure you change your name if your name didn't automatically come up as your own. Charles?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tolson, and thank you all for inviting me and being here. Just quickly, as a preamble, we also work not just with the US, but with Brazil and South Africa. And as you realize, they have their own versions of racism, and that's a concern over there as well. As mentioned during the short bio, I'm an engineer by training, an electrical engineer at that. And so I bring in a certain view of how to make things actually happen, which, as I transitioned from technology to education policy, I was a bit puzzled by how often we have wonderful intentions, but there's no common taxonomy and ontology to describe the possibilities and describe how to make them happen. So this is what I would like to offer today in my my conversation here. First of all, as a technologist, I am certainly one of those who does not believe in technology as a panacea. It's an accelerant, it's a tool, but it's not a panacea. So we have to be really wise about how we use it. It can have just as many dark sides as it has good sides. It's normal. Then distinguish carefully between the how of education versus the what of education. And if we start commingling the two, it's very hard to untangle the spaghetti of what comes first. Then in the modes of action, we have to make sure that we distinguish between an inception mechanism versus a scaling mechanism. And I certainly understand how we would want something to scale, to be big, etc. But very often it starts from a very small, carefully designed kernel. Think of Linux, for example. Carefully designed kernel by a few people really, really cognizant, and then scaled over time with more and more participants. So that's an analogy from the technology world we can keep in mind. So we have tools at our disposal. Here's an ontology that's possibly usable. First of all, we have non-technology tools. Those non-technology tools are either formal, like school curricula, or informal, like the movie industry. In school curricula, civics, history, history is written by the victors, right? So we have to pay attention to revisiting history standards, for instance. Movies, on the informal side. You've witnessed the great strides that the gay community has been making in the past decades. Why? Because there was a significant effort, deliberate effort by the gay community to have what we call in marketing product placement. And so you saw more and more movies where gays were a normal part of a group of friends or whatever. However, when it came to Black American television, it was not like that. It was, well, and here's a Black family for you to look at. rather than, and here's an integrated group of Americans to look at. It shocks me, even when I watch movies from other countries, literally any other country, that the villain is always the person with the darker skin. I mean, it's just like, what kind of message are you sending people? Look at, okay, it's dated, mind you, but Jesus Christ Superstar. Who's in the role of Judas? A black person. I mean, come on. I'd like to see things really reversed explicitly, deliberately by the movie industry. And that can be done. There are groups in the movie industry that pay attention to the social impact of their movies, and those can be addressed by, heck, even an NSF program. So there are both formal and informal ways we can tackle the non-technology aspect. And I'll be glad to think about, half a dozen other possibilities, but it's just to give an ontology of the possible space. Then on the technology side, as I've already mentioned, there's an analytics portion of where you keep track of data, et cetera, where you have algorithmics at large and then AI in particular, ways of keeping track of things. That's wonderful. And there's also other technologies that are experiential, not merely analytical. And that could be, for example, AR and VR, where you put people in situations in other people's shoes, whether it's poverty or anything else, and then you experience it. This is walking in someone else's shoes, see how it feels to you now. So again, if we have these two major categories and two subcategories in each, it would allow us to think about all the various possibilities that can be applied across the board. As an immigrant myself, I was, a recent one, I was shocked to find that my daughter at age 8, in her interview to get into a private school here in the Boston area, mentioned racism as one of her biggest concerns. 8 years old. And I'm like, wow, she's detecting this already? What's the problem? Obviously, other countries are not saints by any stretch. France is not, but it has a different blend, and every country has a different blend of racism that it applies. In France, it's not about skin color, interestingly. It's not, but it's about, for example, religions or whatever. So I have looked at neural networks right after college back in 1990, and I know that now with the processing power we have, we can do all sorts of analytics. But that only can go so far. I think there's a fundamental fairness issue in the United States that simply requires much more political interventions than it requires scientific or social interventions, which is the fairness of income distribution. It's an absurd level when you compare the US and Finland and you see the dispersion of funding to schools in the US side versus Finland's side. So how can we say that we give everyone an opportunity here in this country to rise when one school gets 1/3 or 1/4 of the funding of another school? Then there's also a mythology aspect, which Ivory, as a psychologist, I'm sure you can resonate with. The mythology in the US is, if you work hard enough, you too can be president, or you too can be Usain Bolt. That's mythology. The reality is, what's possible is not what's probable. The deck is stacked against you, kid. It's very, very unlikely you're going to be Usain Bolt or Obama. It's extremely unlikely, but the fact that it has happened does mean that it's open for everybody. And this mixture in the minds of people, this conflation of what's possible versus what's probable, is one of the problems we're facing, because people will take one unusual data point and say, oh, well, that's the norm. No, it's not the norm. So just throwing all these things in the mix, saying there are aspects that are on the sociology part, on the politics part, that could be dealt with. And there are remedies in the tools kit that I have described that can be applied to some of these political sociological problems. And I'm delighted to have the latitude to explore these convergences with all of you guys.
All right, thank you so much, Charles, for that presentation. And you really demonstrated that you've been doing Convergence before it was really a conception. You leveraged your degree in engineering, your expertise in engineering, and you knew that there needed to be a humanistic component to it for it to really move systemic change. So thank you for being a part of this conversation. Next, we have David Watkins, who can give us the perspective of an equity officer who's actually working in the system right now.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Tolson, for allowing me to participate in this rich conversation. As you shared, Broward County is one of the largest school districts in the nation, and Broward County is a very diverse district. And just put it in the context, in our school district, there are 31 cities in our district, plus a county government. There are 16 police departments, plus a sheriff's office that runs the other 15 cities. How we identify our demographic data is that we have about 260,000 children. 109,000 are identified as African American, about 95,000 are identified as Hispanic, and about 44,000 are identified as non-Hispanic white children. And then we have from there our other data to speak to. And what I wanted to kind of bring you to with that information is, we heard earlier from Dr. Billings around Dr. Tolson rather, around the changing demographic of the nation. And so as our nation begins to change, our district is a reflection of that changing demographic. And so one of the things that was very important about a decade ago under the leadership of our current superintendent, Robert Runcie, was to look at the data around the outcomes, the disparity outcomes of variety of subgroups, particularly our African-American students, and particularly more specifically our African-American males. And I know Dr. Tolson has been very involved and instrumental in working with our school system around identifying data and then coming up with strategies to address and closing those negative indicators. And so there were three primary things we targeted: closing the achievement gap between Black males specifically and other subgroups, eliminating the school to prison pipeline around school discipline, school related arrests, suspensions, and expulsions, ensuring that all children have access to some type of mentoring. And we look at that in the form of having an advocate in the school building for children. Our superintendent is well known for the great work of innovation because he comes from technology. He's also an equity champion. And we're also in the district that had one of the worst tragedies in recent school history around the deaths of 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, which is part of the rehabilitation of trauma that takes place in such a large system. And so as we drill down and think about how we continue to move equity work with a lot of competing priorities, one of the things that we found was vitally important in this work was understanding the history of the communities that we're leading and that we're serving. It was very important that as we looked at that data, we understood the conditions that shape the types of communities that show up in our school systems and in our schools each and every day. And so because Broward County is a county that's very transient, has a reputation of being progressive, people from all over the world, all over the country that migrate to Broward County in the last, quarter century, was always very important to understand that Broward County has always been in the traditional American South, and that the laws and policies that affect the communities are generational, and how we engage with those communities is very important. So the generational structures and institutions of racism, the generational structures of redlining and Jim Crow and segregation, and how they appear today impact the type of education outcomes that our kids were still facing today. And that was part of the relearning for our system. Dismantling racism and embedding equity into all aspects of our organization was vitally important. And it had to include cultural competence. It had to include our cultural responsive practices. We had to, we dusted off our state mandates around required instruction, and really took a deep dive into, do we ensure that African American history is infused throughout the year and not just spoken to during the celebratory months? And that included then our Hispanic contributions to the United States, our women's studies, our Holocaust education as starters, and embedding our LGBT, our indigenous studies, and inclusive of groups that are a very important segment of our communities, had to become part of that culture. And that includes, and as an example of that, we may talk about our Haitian heritage work that we're doing, our emancipation work, and bringing that back to the forefront, and making this a year-round experience for children, so they see themselves in the environment. And it's important that they show up. And when they walk into the building, they see reflections of their history, their culture, their life experiences, and experiences of their families. And technology has become central to that work. And so we know that the types of communities our children live in, have a great impact on what they have access to. So when we think about our after-school activities, the communities where they live, do they have access to parks and and after-school sporting activities, or are those things limited to where they live? Do they have mentoring programs and clubs that they can stay after school or go to a safe location to engage in them, or are they academic and enrichment deserts? And we have those experiences, so that's where this conversation continues to be relevant. And are those resources affordable or free for the communities in our system? So those were some things that we had to wrestle with and understand how they impact. And that extended to our healthcare. So the partnerships that we have with our external stakeholders is as much as a community initiative as it is an education initiative. So the access to quality healthcare, and we saw those disparities and how we addressed them. We looked at the access to quality food in those communities that are in Broward County, and we looked at those disparity outcomes and that. And then we've done a lot of work around suicide prevention, and we saw that data, which typically were around more affluent areas, certain areas in our community. But what came to light in the post Margie Stoneman Douglas tragedy was the intense need to make sure that our underrepresented areas are also getting the same level of services that we've now taken to our affluent areas after a mass tragedy. So that's where we really begin to then look at how we address those mental health components as well. And so the impact of community conditions are very, very much a part of the work of addressing equity and the commitment that we had to make to training staff. And then not just training staff, teachers, and administrators, but also collaboration with external stakeholders, our social service agencies, our county government, our law enforcement community, around creating a common language around equity, a common language around implicit bias, what that means, and how we can work together as a community so that our students can have the best outcomes. And so school leaders, really embedded things such as our trauma-informed care, how we provide technology access, our mentoring and clubs were critically important. And so one of the things I would want to highlight, and I think Dr. Toshin shared, is the creation of what we call equity liaisons. And these equity liaisons were piloted by teachers, and this was a teacher-led initiative, because it was important that the folks who were touching the students directly, boots on the ground, really had the opportunity to be at the forefront of these types of conversations. And we did it through an online platform. And technology was central, because when we attempted to do this type of work, brick and mortar, in person, and the struggle was to bring people together, coordinate schedules, getting people from a variety of areas to sit for 2 days or 1 day or 3 days for an intense training was difficult. But using this online platform was a game changer. And there was a lot of controversy about whether or not you could do race equity work as an online platform. And we found tremendous success, similar to how we're able to come together now. We were able to have rich dialogue and conversations, do a self-paced, self-journey that included resources, tools, and strategies on how to do this and how to engage in race, and have protocols, conditions, and how we engage and have these discussions. And so as school leaders and school teachers and community agencies begin to have more conversations, those conversations begin to become more in alignment. And now when we have these conversations around social justice, it's now coming from a place of community and not in buckets of isolation. And so number of courses that were taken, because that was the foundation, having courageous conversations about race, and that opened up the ability to then have training on implicit bias and racial equity institutes and diversity, and a lot of different course offerings that we could provide to teachers to prepare them for the information that they'll need. And then using a variety of platforms and understanding how to use those technology platforms to support and bridge gaps. So when we talk about distance learning, credit recovery programs, using language acquisition opportunities for many of our English language learners, we have a high number of English language learners in South Florida, using the technology to help kids get credentials for post-secondary opportunities, from SAT, ACT prep programming. We've done a lot of work through STEM and college exploration using online platform, and that has allowed more kids to have access to virtual college tours. We as a district paid for every student to have the ability to apply on the Black College Common App. So 56 HBCUs, no fee for them. They just go in and apply to 56 schools with one single application. Those were some of the types of things that we began to do through this collaboration. And creating more opportunities for our students in a variety of ways has been a large part of the work we're doing. And I know time is limited, and I appreciate that. And I'm sure there'll be some questions for me regarding the work we're doing in our district. So thank you for a few minutes, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Tolson.
Okay, thank you so much, David. And everything you said was so important, and it really gives us a lens to look through. And you've talked about a lot of issues that we don't, it's not at the forefront of our minds a lot of times when it comes to the ivory tower. So having you here and talking about those resource challenges and just really giving us a bird's eye view of what happens there. And I did learn a lot through working with you and the equity liaisons. And when we think about the whole notion of distributed agency and thinking about how can we empower people other than the traditional leaders to make these changes. And you talk about things like inequities that exist in the suspensions and placement in honors classes. And in our observations, it's really boils down to one or two people making these decisions, these important decisions that's going to impact so many students' lives. And how do we shift that? How do we create more of a communal process? And the equity liaisons was an approach at doing that, but within a traditional system. So I think that your leadership really provided the seeds of what we're trying to accomplish here. So our last presentation is going to be from someone who actually works in industry for IBM, Chinyere Agunwa, who is going to talk to us about the work that she's doing as an IBM researcher.
Hello, everyone. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be a panelist today. So my name is Chinyere Agunwa, and I am very delighted to be joining to discuss this difficult but very important topic on using technology to mitigate institutional racism in education. While I'm very new to this area of work, just as recent as July, I am very passionate about this topic. So originally, I'm from Nigeria. I actually moved to the United States in 2003. And it was my desire to develop my skills and contribute to the good of society that motivated me to move to the United States. I started off my career at IBM as a medical image analysis and machine learning researcher, and this was in December 2015. In collaboration with Watson Health Imaging, our goal was to build a cognitive assistant that can assist a clinician by using machine learning, computer vision, and text mining techniques to automatically label anomalies, create clinical summaries, and reason about the disease that a patient may have. Being the third Black woman to earn a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford University, I am convinced that diversity and inclusion are important. Representation is important as well, but in addition, power is important, and specifically empowering minorities. I actually truly believe that education is the great equalizer, and it's something that not everyone has access to. Giving you a little bit of an example, my mother's mother did not have the opportunity to even get a college education, despite her father being the traditional ruler of my hometown and having the finances to enable her to pursue their education. He did not believe in women getting educated. On the other hand, all the brothers of my grandmother were sent to the United Kingdom to be educated from Nigeria. And so this education is very important to me, and I'm very passionate about seeing everyone have access to quality education. At IBM, one way that we're actually taking action to advocate for social justice and racial equality is by advancing education, skills, and jobs. As part of our ongoing efforts, in July this year, we announced the creation of 1,000 paid internships for P-Tech students in the United States. And this is from now up until December 31, 2021. And this commitment is a 10 times incremental increase in from our most recent internship goals. In addition, IBM Global University Programs provides resources at no cost or low cost. And in particular, we're currently partnering with historically Black colleges and universities to provide $100 million in assets. In June this year, the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force in IBM Research was launched, and we've taken many actions that reflect commitment to making change within IBM Research in support of the community and global activities. And one of the areas aligned with our mission and impact science is actually to apply our technical expertise and innovation to address some of these critical challenges facing society and the world. And we believe that we can make a difference by applying deep technical expertise to this long-standing issue, and that together with our partners, we can work to bring about real and lasting change. In August, we had a new technical agenda that was announced in IBM Research around tech for racial and social justice. of which I was named the key champion. Our focus is around tech for racial and social justice, and we want to use this agenda of research to drive innovations that address systemic biases and racial and social inequalities. We are prioritizing our efforts to be able to provide trusted insights to enhance core technologies that will address systemic problems such as AI bias, specific solutions to tackle diversity, inclusion, and racial equity, and influence new policies, principles, and standards. Like Dr. Tolson mentioned earlier, we recently announced a new IBM HBCU Quantum Center at the IBM's Quantum Summit. It's a multi-year investment that will bring together researchers and students across a network of 13 HBCUs. The program will actually provide these schools with access to IBM quantum computers via the cloud, educational support for students learning to use the Qiskit open source software development framework, and provide funding for both undergraduate and graduate research. And this is all to create a more diverse quantum-ready workforce for students studying not just physics and chemistry, but computer science, business, and more. See, our education system here was designed for many years to ensure that some got quality education, some mediocre education, and the rest were left out on quality education. And it can be argued that today, the way schools are funded and access is provided to advanced programs, test prep, for-profit charters, is still divided across racial lines. Now, we often turn to technology to help us in solving problems. However, when people of color are represented by society as the problem, the solutions do more harm than good more often. For example, facial recognition technologies targeting suspects based on their color, their skin color. And you may have recently heard that IBM actually pulled out of the facial recognition business, fearing racial profiling. For me, that was a proud moment as an IBMer. We've also trained automated risk profiling systems that disproportionately identify those from the Latinx community as illegal immigrants. We've built credit scoring algorithms that disproportionately identify members of the Black community as risks, thereby hindering their ability to purchase homes, obtain loans, and get jobs. Much of the current discussion of systemic racism in technology focuses on the development of this engineered technology to amplify, reinforce, or conceal systemic racism. And aside from improving these technologies or using their use altogether, there are actually some few innovations that focus on being able to dismantle systemic racism. When aspects of systemic racism is selected and disconstructed, and we understand it from a liberatory perspective, there are opportunities for technology to be applied to disrupt the system. And it's important for us to be able to focus on identifying and framing disruptive technologies that can be used for the purpose of eliminating that chance of systemic racism or discrimination from persisting. So mindful application of technology is very crucial. This is very important. In addition, data is powerful. And to the extent that we can acquire data, this will really help us. Now we can see technology affects every aspect of our lives, social, economic, all around we see impact of technology. It can launch new ways of learning, new ways of teaching, new ways of instructing. It provides avenues for skills enhancement, for bringing people up to speed with the rest of the world. Truly, it is the great equalizer. However, it's important that we're able to analyze and see that the technology that we're developing is not hurting the community that we actually want to support by using this technology. Digital gaps exist, and we want to be able to have minority groups have better access to technology, with internet, with apps, so that they can avail the tools that are designed to be able to report bias, highlight bias, and so on. I was actually really impressed by Professor Brian Brown, who's an associate professor of science education at Stanford Graduate School of Education. And in his work, he conducts mixed methodological work exploring how race, language, and culture impact students learning in the urban science classrooms. Particularly, he's been leading efforts with Science in the City, where he comes up and he works on culturally relevant STEM education. Can we make STEM education more appealing to certain populations? And this work is very powerful. I'm really excited to be part of this think tank today and to be able to work with you all. I look forward to the questions and answers session. I look forward to the breakout sessions to be able to discuss more about these issues. But thank you again for the opportunity to be here and to share my thoughts with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful and really helps us to frame things, with putting technology at the center of a lot of these complex issues that we talk about so much. And hearing you talk just really made me think of all the education panels that I've been on, that we're only talking about education and not talking about technology at all. But having technology as a part of the conversation when we deal with these complex issues really does illuminate it, which is what Convergence is about. So at this point, I want to give right as a tip off into the Q&A portion. I want our discussant to give perspectives on what was shared, and also kick us off with the first question. So our discussant is Dr. Faye Cobb-Payton, who's a program director for the National Science Foundation in the Division of Computer and Network Systems. So Faye.
Thank you, Dr. Tolson. So I am going to summarize what our well-informed speakers talked about. So I'm going to start first with Dr. Billings, which gave a powerful presentation about resetting. And so being a technologist, I'm going to tell you what a hard reset means to me in my world. A hard reset, when you reboot, means that the hardware either restarted on its own or it's user initiated. When it's user initiated, that means there are a lot of internal systems where hardware and software must converge. What I got from Dr. Billings' presentation is that convergence must happen within an ecosystem. It is not just about singularly looking at education, as the equity officer so gladly talked about. So I think that's important in terms of recognizing what that first presentation was about, and what does resetting and hard resetting in particular means for education. I think in light of pandemics, I do believe that, and research has shown that Corona, like Katrina, has only resurfaced the inequities that were there prior. And so in that reset, I think that's important. I think from the next presentation, we heard technology. I was so pleased to hear from Dr. Watson, I believe, that technology is not a panacea. And oftentimes you have technology that is designed in educational space absent of education experts, which is a fallacy. And so I think this idea of priority in terms of experiential versus actually technologies that can be used to tell you and inform you about the analytics and the AI that go on are steeply needed. However, I do want to touch on just something that was said, that there is probabilistic and then there's realistic. I do not want the conversation, and I hope the conversation will not veer into a deficit thinking approach, because realism and probabilistic would suggest that the zip code, and I know that I won't get a point, but I have a lot of other data points that I can point to, that if you were to look at the zip code for which I was reared, I would not be sitting here today. So I think we do not want to, whether the kid decides to be a Usain Bolt or a Barack Obama, we do not want to leave educational decisions, as often as Dr. Tolson said, made by one or two people to determine the trajectories for which young people can go. And I want to point us all to a recent writing in the New York Times that was called The Lost Years. And The Lost Years talks about what technology cannot do. And in absence of wraparound services, we only are going to heighten the inequities that will exist. Then the equity officer talked about particularly the 3 imperatives of closing the achievement gap, particularly for Black boys, the school to prison pipeline, and accessing and having an advocate in the school for children. And I can applaud that. I would say that closing the achievement gap has been something that many of us have long worked on. I think oftentimes the achievement gap is too centrally focused on Black boys. Black girl push out is a real notion. That happens. We cannot ignore that. And by the way, children, whatever their socioeconomic income are, if they are children of color, they need advocates. And I'll say that again, despite the socioeconomic income, all children of color need some advocacy in the classroom. I do like this idea of intergenerational understanding community. Oftentimes we do, as much has been documented, we'll go ahead and we'll pass out notebooks and Chromebooks and not recognizing that not all children have access to 5G to actually have access to the learnings or the content that is to be made available. I applaud IBM for starting the quantum initiative, and I'm very familiar with that. I do think that this idea around interdisciplinary, I was glad to hear the interdisciplinary approach, using faculty from engineering, from computer science, from business, to take a look at cloud activity frameworks, readying a workforce, looking at how AI bias, which is a very prominent topic now, looking at natural language processing. I will end by saying this. I think that there are lots of questions that have been placed and discussions that have been placed in the chat. I hope that this group will continue to talk about, as you converge, that you converge on the idea of that this is an interdisciplinary problem that requires minds from many that are in community. And I'll end with that, Dr. Tolson, for the sake of time, because I know at the top of the hour there was something on the agenda.
Thank you so much.
I have 60 seconds to clarify something, please.
Sure.
Yes, please.
So when I say not confusing the possible with the probable, let's take the example of my daughter. She wanted to study music in college after having practiced 1 hour a week, compared to other kids who practice 8 hours a day or whatever, 6 hours a day. So I said, okay, that doesn't make sense. How about acoustics? Do you like acoustics? Yeah, of course. So she ended up studying physics. And from there on, data science, etc. So my point is, when guidance counselors tell you, well, you too can be Einstein, it doesn't take into account what the kid has actually been prepared to do. It does not mean telling the kid, oh, you come from this zip code, therefore you have no chance. No, it means let's explore what you can be fabulous at, but don't have this preconceived notion, a naive one, that a kid develops about, I'm going to be fabulous as being Einstein, rather than I'm going to be an excellent physicist. You see what it is? The distinction I want to make between the unlikely data point versus the much more likely scenario, which in no way is to be constructed or voiced to the student as limiting their capability, but truly exploring the best that they can be. So it's really not about sorting. It's really about pushing the kid as far as they can go, but with a reasonable lens in mind, not an absurd one. And I realize that in some cases, we may have to have we always have a reach for the stars, so shoot for the stars so you can reach somewhere. But I'm just saying that the way we have to phrase it has to be different from a vacuous mythology, which simply doesn't apply for 99.9% of individuals. It's not a question of sorting, it's a question of helping everyone achieve their complete potential.
Well, I think we could spend quite a bit of time discussing that. quite a bit of time on access to resources and what guidance counselors do and don't do, particularly when it comes to Black and Brown children.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say also socially, those that are on a different social economic status. So I think there's a lot of conversation that could go on about this. And so I'll pass it on to you, Ivory.
Okay. Thank you so much, Faye, for your insights and also your final comment. So there has been a lot of conversation in the chat box. We are a little bit over time. I think we do have time for a couple of questions. We probably could start our smaller think tank sessions, which is only for about 10% of the people who are on the call right now. But we can start that about 10 minutes later than we're scheduled to. I want to start off our Q&A with, I'm going to call on someone who I saw was pretty active in the chat box, Edward Liu. There was a lot of comments that you had there, so I want to give you the opportunity to give the first question.
Well, there was a lot of different things we talked about, so I'm not exactly sure where to start, but I think one...
Well, don't talk about all of it. Just any question that you have for the panelists.
I guess this question about data is one that I've been struggling with, that I think the focus in education has been around this accountability logic, that most of the data that we collect is for accountability purposes. And there's the presumption that this data will also be helpful in driving improvements in teaching and learning. And my view is, what do people think about that? My view actually is that the type of data that we need to drive improvement is very different than the accountability data that we've relied upon.
Okay. Yeah, I want to respond to that quickly and then kick it off to our panelists. But I agree with you. Data should be viewed much differently than it's viewed right now. Data should be viewed more as information, not just these hard points. So that means qualitative data and quantitative data is equally important. I believe real-time data is important and achievable. So if teachers can shift some of those cognitive heavy lifting tasks to computers, perhaps they have more time to just input some of the things that they do every day, and we can keep track of data more in real time. Data should not be used for accountability, but it should be used for system improvement. And so if we're collecting and tracking data real time, then we can improve the system. Data can also be, when we have deviations in standards, as opposed to set standards, it also helps us to look at more rich data. So we can shift it to where teachers don't have to do the exact same thing. In fact, by design, we don't want them to do the same thing because we want to see, some of those different things that happen with their unique style. And then the final thing I'll say is, with data democratization, everybody needs to be trained to learn to use and interpret the data better. And there needs to be more of a peer-to-peer process in looking at data and making decisions rather than someone being the gatekeeper of the data. So these are aspects of the theory of change that's in the white paper. Any of the panelists want to speak to that?
I'll just chime in here a little bit to suggest that most of the data that we collect in schools does little or nothing to help with program improvement at all. I mean, it's useless. Okay. The people making the best use of the data that we currently see in schools are real estate folks. They spread it around to prospective buyers all the time. And I think that Mr. Liu's point about more real-time data assessment is sort of bore out as you watch young people play video games. One of the reasons they love to play them because they know exactly where they are and they know how to correct in the midst of the game. You're going to give me a test in March, and then you're going to tell me in end of May that I didn't do well, and then you're not going to use what happened on that test in September. what's the point? So I think that really there is a call for real-time data, formative assessments, the ability to see how you are doing and to correct in the midst of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rachel, do you want to chime in? Rachel Goins? And you don't have to repeat what you put in the chat box, but do you have any questions for the panel?
No, I think I agree both with Edward and Dr. Ladinson Billings for on both points in that the current data that we collect now, I don't think is the right data for instructional practice or improvements. But I do see them as we need to collect data for all these things, not choose one or the other. Data has been important. The accountability data has been important in calling out disparities in districts and schools. So we still need that data from a civil rights advocacy kind of perspective. But we also need data to improve programs. We need implementation data, and we need instructional data. And so because we need all those data pieces so that we're not overwhelmed and all we're doing is collecting data, we have to focus on what are the most important data pieces, not collecting everything, but collecting what will actually help us make decisions. And that might not be universal across every educational setting.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And typically when I talk to a group of teachers, I'll ask them to define the achievement gap, and they all give very clumsy and awkward responses to that. And then I ask them to forget everything that they know about the achievement gap and how achievement is defined by certain systems, and just give me your view, your personal understanding of what achievement means. And then you get real, you get real answers. You get answers that would make a difference in the lives of students. And I think a lot of the things that they naturally conceptualize as achievement could be captured through data sources, but we don't use those data sources right now because we have this rigid and archaic, reform-minded idea of what achievement is. And so I think when we think about post-reform, we do need to think about what type of data we need to understand what it means to achieve, not a close achievement gap, but achieve in this era that we're in right now. Any other panelists have a response?
Yeah, I have a quick response. I think about the time that I was an assistant principal and principal of kids who were receiving their education in adult jails, in juvenile detention centers, in juvenile residential commitment facilities. And how could we avoid that? And how can we, use information to scale prevention? And one of the things that's, that I found that was valuable, was one, talking to children, and two, educating the teachers on how they can look at their own data and how they can find information that can help them provide resources and access to resources for those kids. And one example I'll give is, looking at children who were 2 or more years over age for the grade they're supposed to be in, particularly at the elementary level. It was one of the greatest aha moments in our district was when I just pulled how many 13-year-olds were sitting in elementary school, how many 16 and 17-year-olds were in middle school, and what interventions and resources can we put in place for those kids? Because the only kids who we often addressed were kids who exhibited behaviors that drew attention to a need to provide interventions, or their behavior attached to their size, maturity, whatever. And so, how do we, use the information to be proactive in supporting children? And then the last thing I'll share quickly, and I'm skipping a lot of points, but when I think about, I made the comment about, Black male achievement, but when we pull data and we talk about Black male achievement in air quotes, we talk about all kids in general who have the multiple risk factors that lead to the outcomes that they have. So I can pull kids who've been retained 2 or more years before they get to the 3rd grade, which is often a problem. And you can see there are all demographics of kids caught in that, and you can see disproportionality, but at the end of the day, how do we address those children provide the support and wraparound services. So how we use that information, I think, is also a change in how we think about data collection and then how we respond to it as a system.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we have time for one more question. Those who have volunteered to take part of the think tank, we're going to start those a little bit late, but we're going to get you out at the same time that we committed to. So the last comment/question will come from Kavita.
Hi, thank you. It's the question I just posted in the chat box about convergence. Oftentimes we are dealing with the visible gatekeepers that control data collection. My concern are the invisible gatekeepers, the Silicon Valley creators of the algorithms that eventually flow over into the education sector. How do we deal with the convergence of racial disparities and inequities that occur across all these digital sectors? There isn't a lot of diversity in Silicon Valley in the people who are creating the programs that large educational districts are purchasing for efficiency purposes. So we can, develop peer-to-peer networks and use the data properly, but if we don't address the people creating the programs and the diversity there, how do we really address convergence interests at this point, in my opinion? Like, that's my question. How do we really address it?
Good question. Panelists?
Yeah, I think what you've mentioned or what you've highlighted is very important there. The technology is as useful or as effective as those who create it. And if there's bias in the creators, there'll definitely be bias in the application of technology and it being able to tackle these issues. So it's definitely important for us to continue to have where people that look like people that are underrepresented and underserved are part of those decision making for AI technologies and are building this. Or there's a process of fairness where there's these technologies are sort of reviewed and gone through to analyze what possible side effects that are adverse could be a result of the technology that's being developed and deployed.
I'd also like to just, first of all, thank the questioner for pointing out the inequity that exists in Silicon Valley. I have a son and daughter-in-law who both work in Silicon Valley. And there is a dirty underbelly to Silicon Valley. If you look at who is, picking up trash, who the custodians are, all those folks are, there's a huge, gap or difference in who those folks are versus who are making decisions. And I think your point about the algorithms is spot on. These things are in some ways just controlling our lives, everything down to who can buy a house. They have an algorithm to determine whether or not you fit. So I think that's really an important point. And then last night I was talking with Christopher Emden, and his concern that we seem to be wanting to push everybody in the so-called STEM fields without recognizing that we're going to be pushing people into a lot of low-level, almost the equivalent of customer service type things, and saying they're in STEM. We have got to get our folks onto the producer side and not just on the consumer side of this equation.
That's a very good point.
If I may respond also to Gayatri. Well, so first of all, it's an issue of profiling at large. Everybody is being profiled, and of course, those who suffer the most from the profiling are those who have, the most need to be helped. And that's so it's a legal question of how much should they be allowed to profile, period, for all of us, and more particularly for those who are the most disadvantaged. So there's that. But I'll also refer you back to my earlier comment. Sure, Silicon Valley, I totally agree with you, but Hollywood as well. So don't forget the other side of California, which is also giving a ton of negative images too. And these images stick in the mind of people. So I'm actually a little bit surprised that that hasn't been picked up in the comments except one person. I was expecting that to have more resonance, and perhaps Faye is correct. I don't fully understand what's happening at with the most disadvantaged side of the population, and I don't have the EQ to say it properly. But I think she was saying something along the lines of, what's it called? Exemplar figures, people you want to emulate or look up to matter. And so be careful, Charles, about how you position that, because some people do need these figures to shoot for the stars.
Yes, that's exactly what I was referring to, Charles.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody so much, and especially thank our panelists. I know we're on Zoom, but if you all can raise your hands and give our panelists a round of applause. So this concludes our town hall portion of this.